Welcome, good morning to everybody. Really glad you could join us. My name's Auriel Majumdar. I'm a coach and consultant and a higher education teacher based here in Sheffield. And I was thrilled to be asked to introduce this really significant event looking at race and governance in Sheffield for a number of reasons, which I'll talk about in a moment. And first of all, I want to officially say thank you to a few people. So thanks to South Yorkshire Housing Association for sponsoring the event. Thank you to Voluntary Action Sheffield for their expert convening of all the people that we're going to hear from this morning, for extending to their networks to bring together interested parties. We're at nearly 130 people now. So thanks to VAS, and also thanks to their collaborators on this initiative, who are Opus and Sadaka. So I know that there's been a lot of hard work behind the scenes to bring this to your screens today. So thank you to everybody. So I just want to say a few words to establish my credentials, really, if I need to, but I do feel a need to. So although I don't work specifically in race equality now, I'm here in two respects, really. So one is that I'm vice chair of Site Gallery in Sheffield. If you don't know it, we're a contemporary art gallery down next to the showroom. Well worth a visit when we're open again. We've got a beautiful new building and we would love to see you in that. And we had been thinking about diversity of our board for a long time. And then, like many of you, I'm sure, the Black Lives Matter, the murder of George Floyd in the summer, and the Black Lives Matter movement that kind of just came to the fore in the aftermath of that terrible murder, was a real catalyst for us thinking again about diversity with renewed vigour. And so I signed up for this event, really wanting to come and hear about best practice and wanting to talk to others about what we could do. And then was subsequently invited to chair, which I was absolutely thrilled to do. So I'm here as a city leader, I think, like many of you, like most of you. But I'm also here because, and not many people know this story. So in the 1980s, very early 1980s, when I was about 22, in 1984, I got a job in what was then called the Sheffield Race Equality Council. So for any of you of a similar vintage to me, you might remember it was run by such tireless activists as Debjani Chatterjee, Dorothy Dixon Barrow, the redoubtable Dorothy Dixon Barrow, much missed, was our chair. And as a young race activist, I worked really, really hard, and we thought, you know, that we were going to change the world. We really did in the 80s. We thought that we had a moment and that things would be better, that we would fight discrimination with evidence. That's what we thought at the Race Equality Council movement, that we would use the evidence from our case studies and that would change policy. So like many of our speakers and many of the people in the audience, I'm conflicted to be sitting here 30 years later, nearly, thinking, where did we get to? And you know, to read, like I'm sure most of you will have read the front pages of the paper today, to be told by Number 10's report that not only is there not a problem of institutional racism, but the UK is exemplary in the way it deals with race, is somewhat of a bitter pill to swallow. And as I was thinking about it this morning, I was thinking, well, the report may say that, but as long as people die younger and have less life expectancy in Tinsley rather than Totley, as long as our black boys attain lower standards of educational attainment in Sheffield than their white counterparts, as long as our young people are stopped more often by the police and disproportionately die in custody more often, as long as our BME populations suffer from COVID-19 more often and are more likely to have long COVID, as long as our audience figures show us that Black and brown people have less access to our cultural offerings in the city, then I don't care personally what that report says. I know that there's plenty of work to do. So it's really thrilling to have this many leaders, people in positions of power here today to listen to what I know are going to be superb speeches and calls to action, so that together we can collaboratively move things forward, because I don't want to be here, or my successors to be here in another 30 years saying, what can we do about race equality in this city? It's not on my watch, not on any of our watches. So that's why I'm here, because this feels really important, and I feel very galvanized by the events over the last summer, and I feel very galvanized by what I read in the papers this morning, because it's wrong. I think it's not right. So I've laid my cards on the table for everybody. We have got, as I say, an absolute array of superb speakers with fantastic testimonies, stories of their lived experience, stories of the initiatives that they're trying in their organisations. What I'd urge you to do is to listen, to take ideas, to share your own ideas in the chat if you want to, so that together we can inspire each other to take action, to do more and to do better. In terms of housekeeping, how we're going to run it, I'll be chairing and keeping everybody to time. And we will be taking, so we're going to hear from our first speaker in a moment. I'll give him his introduction. And then he's going to be in conversation, and then we're going to have a Q&A. So if you want to send questions as you're listening to the speakers, just pop them in the chat, and somebody at VAS, Annalisa at VAS, will be sending the questions to me, and I'll ask them on your behalf. So please do engage through the chat, even though we can't speak in person. So without further ado, it's my absolute pleasure to introduce Dr. Carl George, MBE, author of the Race Report, the Race Code, who describes himself as someone who gets tingly about governance, which just as a governance geek just completely floats my boat, and I hope it does yours too. So I'm just intrigued to know what tingly about governance means and how it looks and feels through the lens of race equality. So Carl, if you'd like to turn your video on, welcome, and turn your mic on as well. I will turn mine off, and really looking forward to hearing what you've got to say. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for that introduction, Auriel. I'm just going to share my screen very quickly so we can start. And yes, thank you very much. I'm going to talk to you today about this race equality code, a little bit about my own experiences, and then we'll have some opportunity afterwards to have a bit of a discussion. But I'm going to start with black swans, wild geese, elephants in the room, and grey rhinos. Yes, I did say that. Swans, geese, elephants, and rhinos. I'm going to start with that before I get on with the talk, because as you heard today, what did the report say? And I haven't read the report yet. I've just seen highlights. But as you said, Auriel, institutional racism doesn't exist. And when I think about organizations that are not in Talib's way of interpreting black swans, but my way of saying that things don't exist, we have organizations who deny there's anything to do with racism that is impacting our society. And then there's organizations who are trying their best by making bold statements, doing lots of different initiatives, but really having no focus and not understanding where they need to be. And I call this the wild goose. And then there's those that are the elephant in the room. You see, they know that there's a problem, they know that there's a challenge, but perhaps, as you said, Auriel, this Black Lives Matters movement may go away if we ignore it long enough. And let's not talk about it. Let's not talk about race specifically. And then finally, there's these grey rhinos. It's where we know it's coming, we know it's going to hit us, but we just don't know what to do. So sometimes there's a paralysis by analysis. And what I'm saying actually is that we've got to put in the work. We've got to talk about race. We need a systematic business-led approach to equality, diversity, or importantly, inclusion. And I think we need a targeted approach. So in terms of background then, I am going to just tell you about my lived experience very quickly, because I'm actually not, as I was saying to the panel earlier, an expert in diversity at all or in race, except for the fact that I'm a black man and grew up in the 80s, remembering police stopping me. I was relatively successful at a young age. I'm a qualified accountant, qualified quite young. And they'd get annoyed because they didn't see any reason why they shouldn't stop me regularly. And I would get annoyed because I'd think, why are you stopping me regularly? In 2005, I'm a community leader in inverted commas, working with the police at Gold Command level, because in Birmingham, which is where that picture is, in Handsworth Park, by the great Vanley Burt, that photograph, we had a challenge between the Black and Asian community where we wanted to make sure we would have some peace. And I'm there organising a peace march. When I move on to 2011 and I start to have conversations with my son, who's now a teenager, when we had the disturbances nationally, I find that I've got the same dialogue from 30 years before. The dial isn't changing fast enough. And I'm not going to go through these statistics, but every statistic we can find, we're either bottom or second to bottom as Black people. And that, in my opinion, needs to change. So I decided I'm going to look at the area of business that I am experienced in, which is in the board and leadership teams. And I don't have to tell you the business case anymore to tie in with the moral case, but we know that diverse companies, not just gender, but ethnicity, increases profitability. 24 billion pounds, McGregor Smith says, and the NASDAQ in New York are looking at saying, if you do not have diverse directors on your board, then we're going to make sure that you don't become registered. And this is great. Moody's saying it actually impacts your credit worthiness to have diversity. So this is Birmingham, where I'm from. We have the Commonwealth Games coming, £800 million. Look at all the procurement. But the picture of the leadership team is astounding in a city that probably is going to be one of the first Black majority cities with one Black man amongst all those people on the board. But is that something surprising to you when we look at the FTSE 100, very similarly? Cabinet members, NHS trusts, accounting companies, law firms, the list goes on. So what I decided to do was look at the reports that deal with workforce and workplace and have a look at all the recommendations. So McGregor Smith, the government sponsored review, Parker, which looks at the private sector, Business in the Community, which has got the Black Voices report recently, but uses McGregor Smith to demonstrate what we should do. And in the NHS, we have the Workforce Race Equality Standard, looking at data and how we can make sure we understand which way to go. Diversity in the boardroom is something that I launched a number of years ago about diversity outside of the FTSE 100 and in the private, public and voluntary sector, looking at age, gender and ethnicity. And more recently, we see the CBI ratio, change the race ratio, and the Football Association Leadership Diversity Code. Why do I say all of this? Because with all of these recommendations, with all of these pledges and promises, which I believe are important, there's something missing because the dial hasn't changed enough. And that's why I decided to pull together a race equality code. Yes, I'm the guy who gets tingly about corporate governance codes. I wrote a governance code that spanned 11 countries and came up with principles endorsed by Sir Adrian Cadbury, the originator of governance codes, particularly in the UK. And I said to myself, why shouldn't we have something similar, an accountability framework around race? Many people at times said, actually, Carl, can't we call it an inclusion code, or can't we look at all protected characteristics? But I wanted to make sure we had a targeted solution. And then the second thing, I wanted there to be some musts, some things that you must do, things that you should do, and things that you could do. So in this governance code, we have 10 musts, and then 41 shoulds and coulds, 51 provisions, very similar to what you'd see in other governance codes, but specifically around race. So just to summarize, I didn't want to reinvent the wheel. What you can see there is the source of these one accountability framework are those 4 reports and a number of other ones down the side. McGregor Smith, as I said, the Workforce Race Equality Standard, Parker, and Business in the Community. And I've got a panel of people that I reached out to nationally who've had some influence in Parker, in the Workforce Race Equality Standard, from government, Deputy Chair of the Equality and Human Rights Commission, I should say, and Derek Webley, who's co-chairing the Windrush Inquiry, and so on. I wanted to bring people together who would help me to make sure, including the academics, that we've got a robust governance code, and black men who've been on the FTSE 100, or FTSE, sorry, as directors. So some principles then, and methodology behind the code. I'll do a quick whistle-stop tour here so that we can get some questions in. But when I say diversity, and when I talk about black, it's not to the exclusion of any other race. It's not to the exclusion of any protected characteristic. And in fact, it is about targeted universalism. And I know about intersectionality, but as we target one area, all other areas can benefit. And this needs to start at the top of an organization in terms of ending systemic racism and structural norms, policies, and practices. The responsibility is at the top. And to have integrity, we've got to look inward first of all, before we can make bold statements, and look at the targets and objectives that we are adhering to, which means zero tolerance to racism, being anti-racist, and making sure, as you'll all be aware, I'm sure, that we move past equality, equity, moving into justice, and making sure we break down those barriers so everybody can achieve. And the reality for me is that if we don't do something now, in spite of the reports that we've seen today, we're at a tipping point, as Malcolm Gladwell puts it in his book. We're at a tipping point where we can make massive change, and we can create those psychologically safe environments for us to talk about race, for people to be comfortable to achieve the best that they can achieve in the boardroom. My focus has been the board and senior leadership team. And just to summarize very quickly how the code works, there's 4 key principles, and I've used the acronym RACE to remind you of those principles. The first one is reporting. We need to report, we need to be open, we need to be transparent, even though sometimes it may not look as good as we want it to look. We need to have that commitment to talk about race amongst the other EDI initiatives. And there you can see what McGregor Smith has said about that in terms of reporting. I think we need to make sure that we're accountable, and we've got actions and outcomes that we're accountable for. And if we don't report and be accountable, then how are we going to shift the dial? As you can see, targets from Parker and McGregor Smith. And then the C is about composition. Let's have a look at the data. One of the things that the highlight said today about the term BAME, many of us have spoken about that in the past, saying that there is a difference between Black and within Asian, Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, and so on. So let's get to the data and let's understand what targets we're looking for and be a little bit more diligent in how we record. So Black Voices report talks about that, and the res from the NHS, very good on data. And then finally, my last of the acronym is education. You see, we need a robust, not training program framework. So we don't just throw people on a training course. What we decide is, what are we going to do to make sure we educate ourselves, educate each other, having clumsy agreements into courageous conversations after we've educated ourselves. So psychologically safe environments for all of us to be able to operate in, as I've said before. And that's what the Race at Work Charter says about education. So in conclusion to this part, we need to examine ourselves against those 7 principles, which I call drivers. We need to apply and explain how are we going to make sure we follow those principles of reporting, of action, of composition and education. And then we can comply or explain to my 51 musts, shoulds and coulds. So if you download the Race Equality Code at theracecode.org, yes, theracecode.org, you'll be able to look at those principles and work your way through. Because it is my belief that if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. And the code is out for consultation at the moment. And what you'll see is that you can be an early adopter and work with our consultants, or you can download it yourself and try and use our self-adoption route to make some real change. What does good look like? There's a systematic business-led approach to EDI. That's what good looks like. I ran a campaign starting in the summer last year, and it said no excuses. You see, I've been able to train with a contract I've got with the Professional Football Association, over 100 ex-professional athletes, most of them footballers. And as you're probably aware, about 30% of the players are Black. But when we look into leadership, like every other area, we find that there is a lack of representation in the boardroom and senior leadership and in management. So what we have is this effective board member program. They train for 6 months, take an exam, and then these people have been able to then get themselves on boards. They're articulate. And when I say that we need to change diversity, I'm not just talking about replacing someone because they're Black. No, they're bringing skills, expertise, a diversity of thinking, and a different way of looking at things. This program started with young leaders. So where we've trained over 100 footballers, we've trained nearly 200 young leaders. And these young leaders come volunteer. I volunteer it for 6 months on a Saturday, once a year. They take the same exam. And I've got some really fantastic examples of what they've been able to achieve. Cabinet members now, someone there is a police and crime commissioner, another person there changed their career, is now a governance professional, someone with the MBE, and so on and so forth. Youngest governor at a school, and so on. So no excuses. Finally, how does this all work? How do we adopt the race code, and what are the next steps? You see, when we work with an organization, we look at their documents, their role descriptions, terms of reference, to try and find out where EDI has been written down and where accountability is. We do a survey to get the culture and understanding. And then we do a review against the governance code's principles, first around governance, before we even look at the race code. So I will conclude there, and perhaps we can have a conversation about how we bring all of this together, and how this ties in with where we are with Sheffield and the city and the leaders that we've got online.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Carl. So much in there to unpack. I'm going to invite Rob Cottrell to join us now, and you and he are going to have an in conversation to explore this even further. Can I remind people that we will then have an opportunity for questions for Carl, so please get them typed in the chat as you're listening. The more provocative, the better, I think. I suspect Carl quite likes a bit of a kickabout. So yeah, just, you know, if you've got questions that challenge you, that you really want to know more about, or to hear Carl's perspective on, please type those in the chat and we'll have them. But over to you, Rob.
Good morning, everyone. Morning, Carl.
Morning, sir.
Before we get started, I noticed Darren Moore there as one of your trained leaders.
Yes.
Well, I'm a Sheffield Wednesday fan myself, so I hope you've done a special job with him, because I need him to save us from relegation. All right.
Yes, he's just moved across, hasn't he?
Yeah, that would be interesting. But to more serious matters, you know, I'm born and bred in Sheffield, Carl. I know Sheffield. I know how it works, and I know what leadership looks like in Sheffield, and it looks like pretty much all those slides that you showed earlier. So I am intrigued as to, you know, how this might be taken up in Sheffield, and so some of my questions are based on that. But before that, you know, given the publication of the Tony Sewell report without the recommendations, interestingly, I wonder if you've got a comment on that. You know, how do we even begin to think about getting this to work now, given, according to Tony, who's, you know, anybody who knows Tony, I'm sure you do, I've known of Tony since the early 1980s. He's had the same narrative for a long, long time. People like you and me, we're responsible for our own problems. We're the creators of it. So no surprises that he got the job for the Conservative government. But slightly putting into a side, what does, on a ground level, what does structural racism look like? Does it exist?
If I put it a different way, Rob, and perhaps Tony might understand what I'm talking about, if I take away some of the language that people don't like to hear. So I am going to talk about structural racism because I do think it does exist. But if I talked about it from a governance perspective, and governance is the systems by which a businesses control the systems that they use. And if we looked at governance sometimes to be able to understand why we get certain outcomes, let's look at those levers that make us get the wrong outcomes that we don't want to achieve. And when I look at the representation in the boardroom and I look at representation in the senior leadership team, as you've seen in Sheffield and we see across every sector, there's something that's wrong. So are there any systems, any policies, any cultural norms that's making that happen? Whatever you want to call it. And what I've recognized is when I look at sometimes how you do your recruitment, the types of question you ask, how you put your panel together, and the type of panel you put together, how you look at career progression, and what you deem to be performance measures. When I look at the systems that organizations use, they produce inequality, and therefore that's structural. Regardless of the people you put in place, you're still going to get those same outcomes. And to change the outcomes, we've got to change those structures. So to me, that's quite obvious because I work with policies and procedures. And if nobody's accountable for something because it's not written into their job description, or if I look at the terms of reference of a committee and it has nothing to do with objectives around making sure we hit those targets, then it won't be measured. And therefore, nobody will do anything with it. I don't know if that's a good starting point.
It's an absolutely good starting point. Thank you. So what you're talking about there, you know, we have been trying to, you know, various organisations and local authorities will say that they've been working with this for many, many years, but we know what the result of that is. So what aren't boards and management teams, what aren't they asking, what aren't they looking at
Excellent. That's a great question, Rob, because linked to what I was just saying, what we need to pay attention to is what these key objectives are. I think I said in the talk that we need a business-led, systematic approach to equality, diversity, and inclusion. And I talked about the wild goose chases, where we've got lots of activities, lots of initiatives. But as you know, we can have this in business, busy fool syndrome, where you're, and I've got a point which is a person who knows not and knows not that they know not is foolish, disregard them. And a person who knows not but believes that they know is dangerous. You see, sometimes just doing things for the sake of doing them doesn't mean we're going to see any change. What we've got to get people to do is say, well, what's the overall strategy? What are the key objectives that we're looking towards? As you do with every other business discipline, if you've got a challenge, you look at it just the same way you look at other business disciplines. So what aren't the boards looking at? They're not looking at what the key objectives are. They're not looking at the approval frameworks for performance management. When I'm evaluating the performance of my leaders, have I got a diversity objectives in that appraisal framework, performance framework? When the boards reflect, which they should do, they should reflect on their own performance. Do I have diversity objectives, including race, as one of the things that I'm testing myself as a board to see that I'm achieving? And if I'm not even looking at that on a regular basis, how am I going to make sure that we demonstrate that there's a movement and there's a shift?
Okay, yeah, I like that. Now, many organisations, including the local authority in Sheffield, will say that they have got a diversity strategy and policies and targets. How do you get them to look a little bit deeper, again, about what is not happening and what's not been happening for decades in Sheffield?
Yeah, that's great. And I think overall EDI strategies are very important. And I don't think we can take race out specifically, as I said, and work on its own. It's got to be part of the overall strategy. And it's a little bit like that Fallow Fields concept of just because we're focusing on race at the moment, and I believe the time is now, like in 2011, when Davis said in gender, let's have a look at moving from 11% in the boardroom, which is closer to 30% now for women in the boardroom. Let's have a look at what we can do about race. And let's take the best practice here and start to have a targeted approach, and then use that targeted approach to benefit all other protected characteristics. But at least we've got some measurement tools and something that we can use currently, something that we can use to make sure that we've got a focus.
You mentioned earlier that and we were talking about this in planning today, that it isn't simply just a case of replacing white faces with black faces. Yeah, it's not simply, it's much deeper. Yeah. So what do, the dominant organisation or local authority, police, NHS, social care, criminal justice agencies, what have they got to start to look at? Because we're not just going to, it's not just going to just flip a coin, but what have they got to look at to actually change the look of their organisation?
Yeah, that's a great point, because sometimes people think when we say we want more black or we want younger or we want women, they sometimes think that that means tokenism or we're dumbing down or we're not going to get the best. And I'm not saying that at all. And what I'm saying is we still want to get, and football's a good analogy, isn't it? Because guess where they get the players from? Wherever the talent is. You've got scouts all over the country. And although like a traditional African Caribbean parent, I wanted an accountant and I wanted an architect and I wanted a investment banker was the oldest one. I've got one who's doing drama, another one who's a footballer. But when they came to me, the scouts, to talk about signing my son. I couldn't believe the amount of information they had, because they find the talent wherever it is. What we've got to do in business is understand that we've got to go out to, you know, people talk about hard to reach. I don't believe in that terminology, and we've got other acronyms that better describe that. But what I'm saying is we've got to open our boundaries. We've got to get to that person who's the connector, who knows where the talent is, and bring that talent in. And the socio-demographic background as well. You're quite right. I happened to not go to university. One of my colleagues, and if you just bear with me for 2 minutes, I digress a little bit if you don't mind. But I remember going on holiday with one of my colleagues who, I grew up in Handsworth. He went to Cambridge. He's a lawyer, I'm an accountant. And we got stuck and suffered some real racist abuse while we were on a resort in the Caribbean. And the way me and my wife was going to respond was completely different from this Cambridge educated, middle class, went to university, where I didn't even go to university. And you probably can guess where I'm going, Rob, in terms of my background and how I dealt with it was completely different from this other black man, because he socialized very, very differently from where I was socialized. And so replacing a black accountant on a board with a white accountant from the same socio-demographic background may not give us that cognitive diversity, that different way of thinking that we want. I'm not arguing that we can't increase representation, but I am arguing that it's a little bit deeper than just changing a white face for a black face. And we have to be more intellectual about how we describe these senior leadership teams and these boardrooms, and then having one person there. You know, I've been the black person on the board. So something black happens and they go, Carl, give us an answer to that. And I go, ah! I can't speak for the whole community. And I don't know if you've been that person on the board, but it just doesn't work like that.
Okay, we know, don't we, that, you know, working with anything that's predicated with race is risky business. It's risky for us. It's risky for those who have got to make some changes. So, what risk are leaders in the city? What risk have they got to be prepared to take to get this embedded into their everyday thinking, to the point where they're not even thinking about it anymore? They're just doing. What risks have they got to take?
Yeah, I think just before I talk about what risks they've got to take, I'd like to just look at the definition of risk. Okay. Because sometimes when we think about risk, we think it's the risk of something happening that we have been, I don't know, when I say I work with high risk young people, I set up an organization called 100 Black Men a number of years ago. And we work with black boys in particular, but across the community. And in this organization, I used to say to people, I work with high risk youth. And the analogy that comes to mind for most people was that I was talking about disadvantaged or vulnerable, which we did work with, but the ones that I worked best with were at risk of not getting into the Russell Group universities. Mm-hmm. I was talking about some really talented black boys who had the ability. They weren't from gang-related backgrounds or anything like that. They just weren't going to get into what they should have achieved their potential. So when we talk about risk, I think the city is going to think about, what about us not being able to, in this fourth industrial revolution, where we've seen younger age populations, where we've seen competitiveness and change, if we can't get the talent that we really need, we're going to be behind other cities. So therefore, the risk is that we don't get the right people so that we are competitive. And if I take risk from that perspective and I say, what do we need to do as a city? I will now start to think about targeted approaches to making sure we deal with, and it is my hobby horse, but underrepresentation throughout the organization, so that we can get that diversity of talent and we can get the best people. Why wouldn't you want to get the best, so that we're competitive and so that we can do our best? So the risk is actually the risk of not doing something. That's the risk. The risk is that we have this laissez-faire and be complacent. And then we'll find that we have other people stealing our people, literally, and a brain drain as they find other places to go.
Yeah, I like that, Carl. But it seems to me that it's been a risk, what you define risk there, and I agree. But it seems to me that that's been a risk that England's been prepared to take for a long, long time, because, you know, the bottom line is that this country is it's not a rich country, it's a wealthy country, regardless of the debt that we've got post COVID-19. So it's prepared to take that risk to continue what it's been doing. So how do we? So the risk that I'm talking about is, well, the risk of giving up some power.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah.
How do we encourage them? You know, the leaders that are in control, because that's what it's about in this city. It's about control. Who controls the information? Who controls who gets what and when? Who controls the resources?
Yeah. And
how do we get them to start to change that? That's the risk.
Yeah, and I think the education, and we talk about succession a lot in boardrooms and leadership teams, and having terms of office and making sure that we transfer and train the next generation and not hold on to the old way of doing things. Mm-hmm. And I'm not saying this just around this particular era and race. I'm saying this from my governance perspective, that I really believe we're in a new era of our organizations need to operate. The old governance structures, the old ways of doing things, we've seen with the pandemic, we've seen with this last 12 to 18 months, that we've had to change the structures, the speed, and even the way we get information. And there's a whole new generation of post-millennials who deal with that information very, very differently, that we need to capture and bring into the framework. Shadow boards, for example, with young people trying to integrate with what we've got experience, professionalism, and getting those people to help us to move forward.
And so then, for you, what will change look like, and by what time?
So great thought. Because I don't want to, as I said to you, I don't want to be talking to my grandchildren about the thing I've talked to my son about. That just is not acceptable to me. So I don't think it's next year or the year after, definitely not. This isn't short term, but I don't think it should be another generation that we're seeing this systemic underrepresentation. I think I've seen 10 years between Davis 2011 and where we are now. So when we started to see the dial shifting. So we started to think about frameworks that help us to think in the next 3 to 5 years, see some real shifting and change. So in the next decade, we're starting to see some real improvement. That means looking at the talent pipeline. That means looking at which sectors people are going to. That means ensuring that we're targeting individuals from school in through to the education system. And it also means that we look at people from different backgrounds than we traditionally would have recruited from in the past. So success looks like, to me, it's very easy visually that when I show them pictures that Operation Black Vote, Raj Tulsiani at Green Park did, when I show them pictures in 10 years' time, they actually look different. They look like and reflect society. They reflect the customer base. They reflect the local population. That's what I think success looks like.
Okay. I think I'm going to ask you my final question. So I'm sure there are loads of questions coming from the audience. And that is, if you had all the city's leaders before you right now, what would you ask of them?
In regards to, and I've got a particular hobby also, which is the race code. So let's say we're speaking specifically about the area that I'm focused on, which is representation in the boardroom and in the senior leadership team. I would have a broad discussion, but in terms of that targeted discussion, I would ask them, as you may say, to adopt the race code. You see, the race code gives them a methodology that we can all buy into. It means we all report on race. We're accountable for what we're saying. We've got the data that demonstrates where the targets and objectives are. And then we educate each other. So everyone applying those main principles across the whole city and across the private, public and voluntary sector will enable us to shift this style together.
Thank you, Carl.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you both. If we were in real life now, there would be a standing ovation, I think, for that conversation, or at least a rousing round of applause. Thank you. Thank you so much. So we have got many questions, as you would expect from the audience. Some superb questions in the chat. I can't get to all of them, but I will pick out some of the just some of the ones that that strike me. So picking up on that point that you ended with, Carl, and when you talked about being the black person on the board or the black person in the organisation, my heart sunk. I thought, yeah, I've been the brown person on many a board. I've, like most of us people of colour in the audience, I've done the head count when I'm sitting in a meeting. I used to, when I was at the City Council, I had the pleasure of taking minutes at exec management team when I was, when I was a junior policy officer back in the day, and counting, so that's the business that most of us have been in, and I don't want my kids to do it, or anybody else's kids to have to do the head count and be the only person of colour in those spaces of power. So I'm with you on that one. Anyway, enough of that. So this, I think, follows on what you were saying before. I've got two questions. I'm going to ask them both together. So we can all do more in our own organisations, but how do we build impetus across the city as a system?
Mm-hmm.
And then this one, which is similar but very specific. So do you think, this is from Andy Buck, do you think Sheffield City Council, our 3 NHS trusts, 2 universities and other leading institutions who are all represented here today, should together develop, invest in and deliver a governance-ready programme for the city? So this is about systemic change in Sheffield.
Thank you for that question. And Rob, didn't get to thank you for our little discussion, Rob. That was great. Thank you for how you facilitated.
Thank you, Rob.
I think the impetus across the city and bringing those institutions together is not a nice thing to do. It's actually fundamental for us to see any change. I'm from Birmingham, as you can probably tell, and in the West Midlands, one of the things I first did was speak to the local authority who've signed up to the code, the West Midlands Combined Authority, so that all the other 7 other local authorities, the biggest housing associations, the private sector, law firms. And what we're trying to do is get everybody collectively to buy into the principles. And by getting all of them to sign up first, the Chartered Institute of Housing, for example, by getting them to sign up, understand the principle, and then sell it to the membership, sell it to all the other people, we're all collectively then on the same sheet. And I think has suggested a governance-ready program that translates across private, public, and voluntary sector, and getting people bought in is not just a nice thing to do. It would be one of my musts, shoulds, and coulds.
Yeah. So we make it a real priority and an imperative, actually, across the city, not just, as you say, not just a nice to do. So I'm going to go from the very big systemic to the small and specific. How can you apply these principles to a very small, entirely voluntary board of a small charitable organisation? And I know we have lots of those represented here today. So your small, voluntary, charitable, how does this apply?
This is really good. Remember, we were talking about our tingly governance. So where we have principles are the same regardless of the size, maturity, complexity of the organization. The provisions, however, may mean that sometimes, this is why we comply or explain, we look at a provision, and because of our size or because of our context, we actually say that's not going to give me a better result. So even if you're a small organization, a small charity, the 4 principles will always be applicable. you apply those principles, and you explain how you're going to do them. But the provisions, you use them based on your size, complexity, and how you think they will impact your performance. And those are the ones where you may say, actually, this one would be nice to do, but we're not big enough, or we haven't got the resources at the moment, or we need a bit of support to make sure we're able to manifest them. So it is a governance issue. It's apply the principles, no matter what size you are, but comply or explain against the provisions.
Yeah, and I guess start somewhere.
Yeah, that's
You know,
right.
rather than thinking it's this huge thing that we've got to do and it's only little us, is make a start on this stuff. Have a plan.
Yeah.
Have an ambition.
And start with those 10 musts.
Yeah.
And the code in by June, we're going to have the next version of the code, because we're updating it all the time because it's out to consultation. But there's 10 musts on there. Start with the 10 musts.
Okay, well, that's good sound advice. So anybody who's out there who's thinking, what's the next step? I would say go to the race code is the next step. So I'm going to ask one more question just because I've got my eye on the clock, and we will hear from you again before we end. So many brilliant questions. So here's, bear with me a second. Let me just find it. So this is a question I think about, I can't find it, but the question in gist was about resilience. So are you optimistic for change, and how do we keep going? You know, for some of us who've been going for 30 years odd, how do we keep resilient and keep fighting?
Yes, I want to encourage all of us, to be honest. It's why in my principles, I talked about reality. Remember the drivers that I went through, and I said it's time for change, but there's a tipping point. I want to encourage all of us because I think this time it's different. There's 375 recommendations since McFerguson and Stephen Lawrence inquiry coming all the way down. And we had loads of reports, including the one that is going to come out today. And we'll get the full report with recommendations, I don't know when. But I think we've had enough of that. We need to act now. It doesn't matter what these reports or recommendations say. So I'm encouraging us to be resilient. I know it seems like this has been going on for decades. It's my point as well, talking to my son. But this feels different. This really does. This time and this space and what we went through, regardless of what you feel about the organisation Black Lives Matters, I'm on about the movement and what that brought out. That tipping point, I think, is making a difference. And let's all come together collectively because we can see that change that we've been asking for a long time.
Yeah, well said, Carl. I'm going to ask one more question. I said I wasn't, but I'm the chair, so hey. What do you think about allyship? Because you know, as Black and brown people, we've been fighting this fight for a long time. And how can our white brothers and sisters be allies in this? And I heard that in when you said, you know, we need to come together. Do you have anything like what are your thoughts about allyship?
Well, definitely, we're all in this together, and I don't see why Black people shouldn't be campaigning for around gender or people with disability, able-bodied people campaigning for people with disability. You see, equality and equity is about fairness for all. So allies are very, very important because they're the ones that can make the change if they're in leadership. And that's why my code starts with the leadership. When I sit down with an organization, I sit down with a board member, the chief executive, and then the EDI person, if that makes sense. It has to come through the organization, but we really need to get the leadership involved. And I've been able to see decisions made in a very short space of time, just because the type of people who are in the room. So allyship, again, isn't a nice, it isn't a should. Actually, it's a must again. Otherwise, this isn't going to work. In fact, the responsibility for changing race inequity in an organization actually isn't with the Black people.
Yeah.
It isn't their responsibility. The responsibility is with the organization to solve that challenge like they would do with any other business challenge that they've got. They'd sit in the boardroom, they'd have a strategy for it, and they'd have an action plan that everybody's accountable for and get measured on a regular basis.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Carl. I wish we could bottle you and keep a little bit of this magic in Sheffield. That I feel super tingly about governance, but it just seems so doable the way you talk about it. So I'd encourage everybody to, I think somebody helpfully has put the link into the chat, so have a look at that. But thank you, Carl, and I'll be coming back to you later, but thank you so much for your time and your wise words. Thank you, Carl. So what we're going to do now, so if Carl, if you want to step back and take a breather for a while, we're going to have a poll. So we're going to do some live polling throughout the event just to see where people are at. So as you're completing this, it's going to pop up in a moment. I'll just say one thing, which is it's anonymous. So here we are, Joe's put them up. So I won't read through them. It's just, you can see multiple choice, yes, no, and there's a multiple choice at the end. So if you could be making your selections on these. So this is to get a baseline about how your EDI initiatives are actually working. Do you think the race code might be able to help you? What do you think about adopting the race code? And it might be that you haven't got the information that you need yet. So we'll give people a couple of moments just to fill that in. As I say, it's anonymous. And then we'll see the results pop up by the magic of Zoom polls. So we've got a number of these just to go through. The data will be collated by VAS and used, as I say, as a baseline, because we need to track progress with this. So people had enough time to fill in? I'm wondering if we can also capture these fantastic questions and comments for use afterwards, perhaps anonymized. So I think we're going to publish the response. So I'll just wait for that. Here we go. This is so magic. It never fails to amaze me. So let's have a look. Wow. Okay, so how compelling is this? Does your current approach to EDI tackle racial equality? That's a resounding 81% of respondents saying no. And it's a starting point. Now we know this, let's ask it again in 6 months or periodically and find out how that's moved. Do you think the race equality code would help? 95%. Really sound, practical actions that you can take. Will you respond? Will you adopt the code, promote to the board? So as leaders, as people of influence on boards, I think that's a great pragmatic response. And find out more about it. Use it to promote those discussions at board level. So thank you for taking part in that. We'll do polls after each speaker around the topics that they've brought up. So now what I'd like to do is invite Mahara, Haque and John Jeffries from South Yorkshire Housing Association to step forward to talk about an initiative that they've been working on. So welcome and thank you. I'll step out.
Hi, everybody. Can you all hear me? This is working. So I'm John Jeffries. I'm non-exec director at South Yorkshire Housing Association. I'm also a non-exec director at Unity Housing Association in Leeds, which is a proud BME association based in Chapeltown and Leeds. I've got, I think, 5 minutes plus to tell you a bit about this new associate NED program that we're introducing in South Yorkshire, and then you'll hear from Mahara, who was the brilliant test pilot for the first run at it, which we got in mostly just before the first lockdown. I've got a couple of slides to show you in a second that will kind of set out the bones of the approach. But one thing I wanted to say first, though, is I don't want to sound like we're making any grand claims for how this will crack the problem of diversity in governance or anything like that at all. The thinking behind it was simply that we wanted to try and do something simple, practical and sustainable that ought in one way or another to help grow the pool of potential Black NED talent available in the Sheffield City region, which is our geography really, SYJ, to the sectors in which we work or work with. So that's housing, voluntary sectors, health, public and care sectors, really. Something fairly straightforward that does what it says on the tin. That was the aim. I'm now going to attempt to share my screen with you for a couple of slides. I hope you can see that. I'll assume that you can. Okay, so, I beg your pardon. The aim was to produce something that involved a ready-made experience package that was firstly manageable in organisational and time for South Yorkshire, so that we knew that we'd be able to sustain it as a rolling programme. We'd keep it up, really. We were thinking of something that was quite stretching, really, for the participants, but realistic for somebody who's working full-time and also living in or around Sheffield. We wanted to develop something that we felt was the kind of thing that was substantial enough to add to your CV, make it worthwhile to put it in your CV, and also to use it to advantage potentially, for example, in a job interview or something like that, the kind of thing that you could get some kind of direct benefit from, as well as interest. Importantly, we decided that it was best to make it a kind of standalone thing, so that it's not linked, it's an experience thing, but it's not linked to a formal expectation or an assessment at the end or anything like that about joining the board or not joining the board or going on to anything else. It just stands on its own 2 feet. But obviously, in reality, it's also a great way of a participant and SYHA getting to know each other. So we're certainly expecting that in the long run, it should add to the kind of what I would describe as the pool of potential NEDs that are out there that we might want to be able to talk to when we're recruiting permanently to the board long term. We also wanted to be able to test for barriers, discouraging engagement of younger BME people in governance. So we're hoping that it'll tell us more about that. And also it would give us some feedback on the way we work from what I've described here as an engaged new face. We like feedback at SYHA. We get a lot of people in to observe, for example, our boards, and we always make them tell us what they thought. Okay, so the bones of the package, fairly straightforward. It's a 6-month commitment. At the outset, there's a timetable set out. It's not sort of over-organised, but we would, the first example, we probably under-organised it a little bit. I think Mahara will probably say that. But there's a timetable set out and some simple aims and organisation and so on that goes with the whole thing, so you know what you're doing and where you've got to be and so on. The simple aim basically is to go to enough meetings to get a good feel for the totality of governance. So in our case, that's really going to 2 or more of our main board meetings, their monthly meetings. So you get at least a couple of those. Go to 1 audit committee. That's a fairly significant committee for us, given the nature of the organisation. And also our enterprise board, which is where the more risky non-commercial stuff is done. So you get a bit of that. And also we have roughly twice a year, we have away days, and the participant will be able to go to one of those. So you get the kind of round of what's going on in governance terms. You get a non-exec director mentor. Essentially, it's fairly straightforward that you have the initial meeting, the introductions, a bit of support, mainly meeting up before and after meetings and so on, so that it kind of fits in with the role of the meetings agendas. You get to meet the chair of the board, chair of audit and chair of enterprise, so you can have a separate discussion with them. And you also get to meet a couple of people off the senior team, exec directors and so on. You get all the non-confidential papers to read, and you have to try and read them. And we decided to say that you can make comments and questions in meetings, although I think realistically, we also recognise that's quite a big challenge for a new face in a board. So I think we would always make it clear that no one's expected to be able to come along to, for example, quite a dense board meeting and make a substantial contribution. But in fact, Mahara was able to comment and question comfortably, and that worked very well, actually. We simply ask at the end that the participant writes up a thoughts paper, a kind of review paper, which would be shared with the board. And there's a final review, fairly formal, with the chair and the mentor, and a concluding note to wrap the whole thing up at the end. Final point then, reasonable expenses paid. And that's the bones of the scheme. Before I pass over to Mahara, I'd like to stick in 2 plugs, if I may, please. So if anybody can think of anybody who might be interested in this scheme, please give them a nudge. We'd be absolutely delighted to hear from them, please. Secondly, just at the moment, SYHA, we are recruiting 2 permanent main board members. And if anybody can think of anybody, or they are themselves potentially interested in this, again, we would love to hear from you. And with that, I will pass over to Mahara.
Afternoon all. My name's Mahara. I'd like to start off by saying I'm glad this is on Zoom format. I'd be absolutely petrified if I had to do some kind of public speaking. So I'm just going to pretend you guys aren't all here and I'm speaking to a computer, which makes it easy for myself. So I'd like to start off by telling you a bit more about myself. I'm currently working as an external funding manager within a voluntary sector organisation in Rotherham. I've had background of programme management at Rotherham Council, community development at Sheffield Council. I've worked at a few different voluntary sector organisations. I am part of setting up a voluntary organisation within my local community. And as you can tell, I'm quite a busy bee. I've been interested in housing for quite a long time. Me and my partner are both landlords. We have a small portfolio of properties. In the midst of the pandemic, we decided to set up an ethical letting agency. It is called My Landlord Cares. There's a lot of negativity around landlords in the media, and we wanted to challenge the narrative. We knew that landlords were all tarnished with the same brush, but there are many who are looking for more social value from their property investment. This is why we set up. So I'll start off the question around what are boards. Now, if you asked me this question 2 years ago, I would have said, it's somewhere that I have to go and present at, and it's not a very positive experience. You come out with many actions and loads of different questions. It definitely wasn't something that I was even remotely interested 2 years ago. And for one, I don't have a clue of how you got on. I was educated through the times of austerity. There was a lack of career advice due to funding cuts. So I didn't really understand the role and how to get on there. So I almost accidentally fell into this space. At the time, I went for an interview at South Yorkshire Housing Association, and I wasn't offered the position, but the recruitment manager took a liking to me, and she called me back to meet the chief executive of South Yorkshire Housing Association, Tony, and senior people from the senior management team. And that's where the idea was floated around the associate NED. Naively, I thought at the time that, this would be an opportunity and I'd probably get a job out of this, but instead my whole idea about working changed. Now, I'd like to tell you a bit more about my experience at South Yorkshire Housing Association. It was really full on. There was no minimum attendance. It was very fluid. I embraced the learning. I have a growth mindset, so this suited me very well. There was so many different things going on, so many events, and very interesting it was. There was stuff like women in social housing and place shapers. So I'd work a full day, I'd catch the bus to Sheffield, and I'll attend a board meeting, and I'd come home quite late. I've got 3 kids as well, so I wouldn't see them all day, which sometimes isn't such a bad thing. It was information overload on a lot of occasions. We had a NED away day, and there was a big chunk around financial review. So, it was about learning really quickly. I had a really good mentor in John. He was very supportive, gave me the space. I met him regularly around the meetings. And I really enjoyed the social element of this. Boards can be really cold. So having this kind of understanding around the meeting was very helpful. So how has this experience helped me? This experience finished in April 2020. This was the start for us of a lot of lockdowns, and the global pandemic changed the world as we know it. Overall, I do think I've changed in my way of thinking. I've become more strategic, more confident in my own abilities. I'm looking at governance differently, looking at collective working and long-term solutions. I've been able to secure some positions within boards. So I'm a public representative at Speak Committee at NHS Sheffield. Now, don't ask me what Speak stands for. You know, the NHS is ruthless for its acronyms, but it's about engagement and equality. Also, recently, I've become a co-optee customer service executive committee at Burnsley Homes in Barnsley. I have been fortunate to have people around me who have believed in me, even when I sometimes didn't, or I didn't see my own potential. And this opportunity definitely has been a stepping stone for something bigger. I'm not sure about what the future holds for me, but I'm definitely excited about it. Thank you, and that concludes my part.
Thank you so much, Mahara, and thank you, John, as well. What I love to hear, listening to both of you, is that perfect marriage of a plan and an intention, and then the lived experience. And to hear Mahara talking about the impacts that's had for her really fills me with hope. So we've gone from the big to the particular, and it's how it all works together that will really make the difference. We're going to do another poll now, so if that could pop up. This is a shorter one. So having heard what you've heard from John and Mahara, would you consider it setting up an NED, non-exec director or trustee placement opportunity? So there's some options there for you to answer. And what further, if your answer is no or maybe, what further support would you need? So is it something you'd consider, and what would you need? While you're filling that in, while we wait for the results, and again, this is anonymous, so responses won't be identifiable to the organisation or you as individuals. Keep your eye on the chat. There are some really fantastic sharing of experience, a fascinating debate about the term good practice. And what it makes me think is, during the pandemic, the Black Lives Matter upswell, you know, the attention that we started to play to race, the attention that we started to play to gender issues in the UK, following the death of Sarah Everard. It seems to me, I mean, I'm an optimistic kind of person, but I'm thinking there's a loosening here. There's a loosening of the way we've always done things, and an opportunity to redo things in a different way. And that's what I'm hearing in this practical initiative, because these things don't have to be big and complicated, and there is support out there to help you do it. So when the results are ready, we'll have a look at those. I'm also really heartened to see that people are finding this very thought-provoking and interesting. So that's really good to hear. So let's have a look. I will promote this to our board. So my challenge to you, if you're, I get, you know, as a vice chair, I get that you don't all have chair's action or a mandate to agree to everything, and probably taking it back to board is the pragmatic next step. But I would hold us all, including me, to account. This needs to happen. These conversations need to happen. So who's going to take responsibility to make sure that does? So we've got some yes definitelys there, not quite a quarter, but nearly. A kind of definitely, as long as the board agrees, and then I think it sounds like an opening up to a board conversation. A few no's, that would be interesting to explore. A few who already have a placement scheme, interestingly. So there is already there are already examples out there. And then what further support would enable you to set one up? Further workshops, some more information, maybe some more sharing from people who've done it, informal discussion, or no further support needed. So there you can see nearly half are saying, let's have some more input on this. So interesting. I'll leave that there. So let's proceed. We're beautifully on time. So next we're going to have Craig Barnett from the City of Sanctuary, and we're going to hear about their approach to diversifying trustees. I know from site's perspective, this is something we've been really paying a lot of attention to, and any and all ideas or examples of how other people have done it are just going to be super useful for us. So Craig, over to you.
Thank you. So I'm co-chair with Majid, who's also here today, of City of Sanctuary Sheffield, which is a small charity. We work with people seeking sanctuary to help Sheffield to become a welcoming city. So about 3 years ago, we had 10 trustees and 9 of them were white. Of course, like everyone involved, and like a lot of white people I think have been involved in this kind of sector for a long time, I was always conscious of the desirability of having a more diverse board, and of how, you know, we were all keen to have more people with more diverse lived experience joining us, but there always seemed to be difficulties in practice, and so I just become used to seeing this as normal, you know, looking around a table and seeing 9 white faces and just accepting, well, that's just the way it has to be. In effect, I was sort of taking good intentions as being more important than outcomes, and just accepting it, really. But thankfully, I got the jolt that I really needed to start getting serious about changing that. It was a colleague in another organisation who just referred in passing to City of Sanctuary as a white-led organisation. And it wasn't said in a critical way, it was just in the course of a conversation, but it really gave me a shock to see ourselves as others saw us. And that was partly, of course, because I didn't want our organisation to be seen like that by anyone, you know, particularly by the people we work with, who are you know, people seeking sanctuary, but by anyone at all. And also, I started to think more deeply and to learn about what we were actually missing out on by being a white-led organisation and a white-dominated organisation. The different perspectives, the different experiences, the different connections that we were missing, that were absent from our board meetings and from our decision-making and from our thinking as an organisation. So we started to look at what actions we could take. We're still on the way with this, so I'm not presenting this as being experts on it. But I think there are 5 main actions that we've taken so far. So the first thing, I think the most important thing for us, was about expanding our idea of what we need for a trustee. There's a kind of, you know, traditional idea that trustees you need somebody who's an accountant, you need somebody who's with HR, and somebody who's got, you know, management experience, somebody legal if possible, and that's all you need. But I think the really key thing was beginning to understand that actually, if you haven't got people who know what it's like to be a refugee, if you haven't got people who've got connections in Muslim communities in the city, if you haven't got people who are connected with Afro-Caribbean communities, then we're missing something really important. So that those things are also key core skills and abilities and perspectives that we need to have. If we don't have them, then we need to get them. So that means we decided to increase the size of our board, because it meant, obviously, there's a lot of skills here, a lot of perspectives, a lot of connections that we're missing out on. We need to get them. That means we need more people. So we increased the size of our board from 10 to 15. And then we, of course, we'd already been advertising for trustees through PAS and in other ways. But we actually started to go out with personal invitations to people who we knew through our contacts. Obviously, we're in contact with a lot of refugee communities, but all sorts of other people who we identified as having, you know, potential skills, connections, lived experience that we needed. And we actually asked them, approached them, you know, had you ever thought of being a trustee? You know, would you be interested? And that was the most powerful approach that we found, because I spoke to someone, for instance, who has got is a professional interpreter. She's got connections throughout all sorts of refugee communities. She also sees behind the scenes of all sorts of organisations where she interprets. But she'd said to me, "Oh, you know, I'd never considered being a trustee. Nobody'd ever asked me about it, so she would never have applied for it. But by having that conversation, she decided to join the board." So those personal invitations are really key, have proved to be really key for us, not just relying on a kind of formal advertising and application process. And then it's a matter of not just bringing people in, but about how people can be enabled and supported to play an active role, to find it rewarding, to feel welcomed. As Mahara mentioned, boards can feel very cold. And one of the things that we realized we really needed to do as we started to recruit a number of new people at the same time was we need to make this a welcoming environment. So we need to focus on getting to know each other, some team building, making sure that there was a bit of informal check-in time at the beginning of every meeting for people to get a sense of each other. Obviously, it's been hit by all the COVID stuff, but we're looking forward to when we can start meeting again in person and doing some more of that, getting to know each other and sharing each other's lives a little bit. But also looking at what kind of support for people who've not had opportunities to do this kind of role in the past, what kind of support in terms of training, buddying, mentoring are useful for people. And that's obviously going to differ depending on their own particular circumstances and their own experience. And as part of that, making sure that there are roles within the board which are suitable for people with different circumstances. One of the problems with the model of trustees that we've inherited is where it's assumed that everybody is going to be a retired white professional, then everybody has got unlimited amount of time to put into reading documents. Everybody's got plenty of money. Everyone's got plenty of leisure. And where you're bringing in a more diverse kind of life experience, obviously, you need to be more adaptive to the different circumstances and the different pressures that people are under, particularly people who are in the asylum system in some way. But also not just making it a token thing, or we don't expect someone to contribute because they've got lots of other issues in their lives. It's about finding, okay, what contribution will work for them, and enabling them to be able to make that contribution so that they feel that they're doing something, they can find it rewarding as well, and also making a contribution to the organisation in the right way, in the way that works for them. And finally, we set a target. So I said it's not enough just to have an aspiration, the outcome has got to be there. So we set ourselves a target of having a minimum of 50% people of colour on our board. And that's meant turning away some people who've actually approached us about becoming trustees, because we told them until we get to that point, we're not going to be recruiting any more white trustees, because we're focusing on improving the diversity of our board. Now, we're not quite there yet. We've got, at the moment, we've got 14 trustees, 6 of them are people of colour, but they're from, we now have a board which is much more diverse, not just in terms of race, but in terms of people's life experience, their connections with different communities, their ages, their backgrounds. And as a result of that, it's working much better. We're getting much more useful input into our decision-making, direct feedback from people who really know what they're talking about and know the people and know the different communities, because there's so many different communities just in terms of the refugee experience. And we're still, working on developing it and learning from it and continuing to learn from this process. There's a lot more that it needs to be explored, because obviously this is not completely straightforward. If it was, all these organisations like ours would have done this long ago, and there's a lot more to be done on it. And there's going to be a follow-up workshop in May, which I'd invite anybody who's interested in looking at this to take part in, and at that we'll also have some contributions from people of colour who've joined white-dominated organisations to share what that's like and what we can learn from their experience. That's me. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Craig. It strikes me as I listen to that that it really picks up on that excellent point that Rob made in conversation with Carl when he talked about the need to step aside, to give up power to allow other people to come into the space, or to make space for them to come in. And I hear that really strongly in that it wasn't just, a tokenistic, we'll have a few more different people on the board, but actually changing things so that their participation is meaningful. And I wanted to pick up on a comment that Dr. Muna Abdi had made in the chat that I think just expresses it beautifully. So she says structural changes need to happen alongside, or he, sorry, I don't know if it's he or she, need to happen alongside improving diversity of representation. Otherwise, you're inviting people to work within structures that are designed to disadvantage them. Work on diverse representation alone becomes performative. And I think that comment sits really beautifully alongside, Craig, your story of how City of Sanctuary is really committed to changing things more widely so that you can have a more diverse board that's effective. So we're going to do another poll now. This is a really straightforward one, so that will pop up. So having heard what you've heard from Craig, what do you think about this question of creating more spaces on your board to include people with a diversity of lived experience, bearing in mind what we've just said about, you know, doing that really and not in a tokenistic way? So where does that take you? Is that a yes, no, maybe? So we'll have the results from that in a moment. So while we're waiting for the results, I will congratulate you on your stamina for staying with us. The numbers are still high. So I assume some people may be podcasting this with their headphones on and maybe resting their eyes, but I think it's testament to the vibrancy of what we've been hearing and the importance of the questions that we're asking here. So do we have the poll results? Here we go. So will you create more spaces on your board to include people with a diversity of lived experience? Well, nearly half in this room who are decision makers, leaders, you know, at high levels in all sorts of different organisations, nearly half say yes, definitely. And then the next highest is I will promote this to our board. So what I'm thinking forward to is the next time we meet, when we ask about progress, and let's see that turn into action. So finally, and by no means least, let's hear from Shahida Sadiq, who has a long legacy. I know she's going to tell us where she comes from and who she is and her proud background, who's going to talk to us about the ghost of governance, past and future. I'm intrigued and fascinated. I can't wait. So thank you, Shahida.
Thank you, Auriel. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Shahida Sadiq. I'm the Chief Exec of an organisation called Faith Start. Some of you will have already done some work with us and heard of us, and for some of you will be new, so you can check out our website. I'm really sort of conflicted and excited to be here. There are a lot of names that I've seen in the attendees, and you know, people we've had conversations with about governance over a number of years. So part of me feels very excited that we're kind of developing and moving this conversation around governance and race and governance in the city forward. So that's good. Part of me feels very conflicted because it's here we go again, and what's going to be different this time. Hence some thoughts and reflections on what I'm going to speak about in terms of the ghost of governance, because I think there's a ghost, a spectre that haunts our boardrooms and committees and management committees. It's a spectre that walks amongst us, and I think if we don't lay it to rest, it's going to be something that haunts us. It's haunted us in the past and it will haunt us in the future. And I think it's really important that we start to explore some of those issues, because if we don't, we're never going to be able to move forward with these things. And some of the stuff around governance, Carl and Rob and others have mentioned, so I'm not going to go over that, but I'm going to talk from a very Sheffield centric perspective. And this is a perspective of governance over a number of years, coming at it from a sort of personal experience, micro and macro, and also kind of looking at this from a perspective on how we can change things. I was asked for the presentation to end on a call for action, which I will do after sort of some of these reflections. So what can I say to you as leadership, as people responsible for governance within your organizations? And again, these are my individual experiences. These are conversations that I've had with people, and by no means you know, other people have got different experiences, but these are my personal experiences. So the first thing I'd like to say is stop painting by colours. And what I mean by that is when you look at your board and you kind of go, oh, they're a bit pale, male and stale. I think we need a bit of colour in here. we need to improve our diversity quota. Just stop, because actually all you're doing is, and many people have mentioned it in the chat, but it's performative, it's tokenistic, it's not meaningful. It isn't meaningful at all. And you're not really addressing structural inequality on your boards. What you're doing is, well, actually, if we can get a black or a brown person just to make our, you know, on our webpage, our photo board members look a bit more diverse, that's not really doing the work. And the second point I'd like to make is diversity, inclusion, and unconscious bias training is not, and I repeat, not addressing racial and social equity on your boards in terms of governance. And the reason why I say that is you need to understand the difference between all of those things, and you need to be asking yourselves as a board, what is the purpose for what we are doing? If you want to diversify your board, by all means. If you want to be more inclusive, by all means. If you want to have unconscious bias training, by all means. But if you want to address racial and social structural inequalities in this city, then understand that purpose. So what is the purpose for what it is you're wanting to do and why it is you're wanting to change your board? Those are very, very different things. Understand the difference. And then the third point I want to make is around paternalism. We're renowned for it in Sheffield, and especially on decision-making bodies, on boards and committees across all the sectors. And it's something we seriously need to stop doing to communities. We need to start doing with communities, centering communities, whether that's culturally diverse, ethnically diverse, economically diverse communities. We need to center them in the service provision, in the decision making, in the policy development, in whatever it is what we're trying to do as a board, be that private, public or VCF sector. And our boards need to reflect our communities. At the next census, 25% of the communities of Sheffield will be from a culturally and ethnically diverse background. Do our boards reflect those communities? Something to think about. And I think also on that point, you know, we can't disregard the intergenerational changes. You know, we have to stop designing policy and designing board structures and strategy for our communities that just completely discount and disregard the fact that some of our communities have been here for generations. My father, like many of his generation, were pioneers in this city. And yet I'm still having the same conversation 50, 60 years later with my dad. And I think Carl mentioned it earlier and Rob talked about it as well. Intergenerationally, we can't keep having the same conversation unless we start getting those younger people into those boards and we retain that talent in the city. It's so important. And the next point I want to make is about, we need to really stop using the term austerity as an excuse for not tackling equity and governance, because Black and brown communities are the first to have their services cut and the last to have them reinstated. Think on that one. And the other thing I want to say is, please stop saying to Black and brown people of colour on your boards, this is just a personal gripe of mine, wow, you speak so eloquently. Oh, you spoke so eloquently. As a euphemism for what you're actually saying is, wow, your English was really good and I actually understood you. Get over it. We're in 2021. So just want to say that, okay? Unless, of course, they really do say something eloquent and you really do mean it. But guaranteed most of the time when I've heard that comment, it isn't. And then last but not least, some of the next point I want to make is, we haven't got enough seats on the board, Shahida. And if we opened up the board, well, then we'd have to give every single BAME community a seat. And there just isn't enough people to do that. There's just not enough seats to do that. And it'd be like opening the floodgates. Okay, think on that one as well, because, you know, having people with cognitive diversity, as Carl mentioned earlier, having people that know how to engage communities, talk to communities, be with communities, have and share that lived experiences. There are talented people in the city that can do that. You don't need to create 25 seats. And last but not least, this is my call for racial and social equity. I'm just looking at the time. Say what you mean and say who you mean. And my example of that is, look at your services, your product delivery, your organizations, your service delivery, whatever the hell it is that you're doing, and name it, mean it, and name the people. So as an example, if you want to reduce infant mortality, but for African, Caribbean and Asian women, say that. If you want to improve the educational attainment of Black Caribbean young boys in Sheffield, say that. And it is really important to say what we mean and name who we mean, instead of lumping everybody together and using terminology like BAME and all the rest of it. Say who you mean and say what you mean. That is really important. And my final point is 25% of the population in Sheffield will be from a culturally and ethnically diverse background by the next census. And my challenge to you is that by the year 2025, 25% of your boards reflect that ethnic diversity in Sheffield. And I'll finish there.
And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why you have a Sheffield woman to finish your event. Thank you so much, Shahida. Fantastic. I can feel my blood pumping around my body. I feel really energized and provoked and stimulated. So thank you for finishing in such grand style. I've got some figures just to add a bit of data to what Shahida was saying. So Paul at VAS tells me that a straw poll survey that they did of attendees for this event, asking about composition of boards, we've got 57% women. This is from respondees for this event. 27% people of colour. Of those 57% women, 25% of those are women of colour. So we've got some way to go. I also wanted to share a story, which is a sad story, really, but just to echo what Shahida said. So a few years ago, I was head of service at the council, and I was deputising for someone at a very senior meeting, and went to the loo, was drying my hands at the hand dryer, and a very senior officer who's not there anymore came over to me, looked at my name badge and went, "Oh, where's that name from?" And I said, "It's Bengali." And she said, "You speak marvellous English. Have you been here long?" And I felt, this was me. I was probably in my 40s then, professional, educated, middle class, and I felt that big. So language matters. Tone matters. If we can be more straightforward, as Shahida says, I think things will improve. So I just want to offer that as my own lived experience. But well said to you, Shahida, indeed. Thank you. So what I'm going to do now, while we're all fired up, is we're not going to have another poll now. We're going to have a longer poll at the end, which is more of a questionnaire, and that will take us forward to next steps. But what I'd like to do now is invite our speakers to step forward. So if you'd like to turn your mics off and show your faces, turn your videos on. And as Shahida said, we've asked everybody to leave us with a call for action. So either a provocation, a challenge. I don't think we're in the business of requests. So demands, let's have demands. And I'll just go, in fact, let's do it in the order that people spoke. So Carl, what's yours?
I think it's an easy one for me, because I'm suggesting not that you have to adopt the race code, but adopt the 4 principles. So even if you can't adopt the race code, apply and explain those 4 principles that you're going to report, what actions you're going to make, what you're going to measure, and education, as was eloquently put by Shahida at the end.
Brilliant, thank you. So we've come full circle there, fantastic. Rob, how about you?
Give me 2 minutes. I'm just trying to find what I wrote down.
Okay, yeah, we'll come back to you. Okay, so I'll go in order then. So Mahara, what's your challenge to the leaders of Sheffield?
My challenge is, how will you make it easier for people like me to be part of your boards?
Nice, straightforward challenge. Lovely. Great question. John, how about you?
My challenge, I think, is based on my observation of the of what's going on in the housing association world the last few years, really around a recognition there's a need to greatly improve diversity on boards in housing associations. Far too many old white men like me, basically, the usual problem. And my observation, and some organisations have got a lot further than this than others, is the truth. And my observation about the ones that have succeeded as against the ones that don't seem to get very far is that the ones that have succeeded, it's not as if they have any kind of magical solutions or kind of wonderful ways of doing things that suddenly crack the problem. They just try harder. Actually, they're the ones who are really trying harder, and one way or another, they do get a lot further. So I think my kind of challenge really would be to say, well, you know, the way forward is to go out and do stuff, and be determined about it. If it doesn't work perfectly, do it again.
Brilliant. Good old Sheffield activism, give it a go. Fantastic. Thank you. So Craig, I'll go to you next.
So my challenge would be, perhaps especially if we're in committees or boards where we're facing pushback from white members, to really be clear about challenging that and saying that it's no longer enough to have good intentions, or to be, you know, to think, oh, well, we would love to have more diverse board. That's not enough. Our intention's not enough. We've got to see the outcomes, and we've got to do what it takes to see the outcomes. And until we get there, we're not going to give up.
Brilliant. Thank you. So I'll go, Shahida. I bet you've got a million provocations up your sleeve, and then I'll come to you, Rob, last. So Shahida, what else have you got for us?
I think just picking up on Muna's point in there, what does 25% of change mean? And when I say 25 by 25, I mean 25% of decision makers in Sheffield sitting on decision making bodies that impact resources, people, spaces and places are made up of people from culturally diverse backgrounds and communities in Sheffield who sound like the people that they save, look like the people that they save, and have and share the same lived experiences of people there, because that's how you're going to change and transform this city, by involving the citizens of this city. So for me, the 25% of change, what does that look like, is 25% of decision makers in this city reflect those communities.
Brilliant. Thank you for that. So finally, Rob, how about you? What challenge have you got?
So someone asked a great question. I'm not sure in what context, but Julie asked why there was no one from education here or speaking here. And it just reminded me of some of the things that we're trying to drive up with Carl, because for me, it's not so much about what's being said. We've had some great speakers and some great contributions, some fantastic questions, some very thought-provoking questions. For me, it's the questions and contributions that have not been made today, you know, from certain leaders and organisations in the city. So my challenge is for everyone here who's a leader or has an influence on leadership in this city. Number one, the challenge is to adopt the race code. And number two, to get an organisation or a leader that's not present here to adopt it.
Nice. Like your thinking. So send the ripples out. Yeah, definitely. Tell a friend. Demand from a friend. Brilliant. Thank you, Rob, for that. I'm going to do one as well, just because I can, because I'm the chair. Mine is for the decision makers in the room, and I know there's lots here. Don't hide behind complexity. Yes, race equality is complex and multi-layered, but actions do not need to be complicated. You know, as set out in the race code, as we've heard from all the speakers here, we can do things about it. So don't hide behind complexity or use that as an excuse to not take action. So that would be mine. I want to, in absence of everybody standing up and hollering, because these speakers have all been so fabulous, could we just have a show of thanks in the chat? So if you could show your appreciation in one word or whatever, just so that we can say thank you to all our fantastic speakers. Thank you so much for your time. I think you're going to hang around now until we finish at 1. What we're going to do is just start the poll now. So you'll see the polls coming up. But I want to say, while you're looking at the poll, I want to say a huge thank you to all of you. Thank you. You give me heart. You encourage me. I feel so connected back into this issue. It's sometimes you sit on your own and despair, but to be part of a community like this today has really, really encouraged me and put a spring back in my step. So thank you for fighting the good fight, and go well to our panelists. So I'll ask you to turn your cameras and mics back off again while we do the panel, and you can just revel in the gorgeous comments that you're getting there. So you'll see the poll. So the questions, I can't see it for some reason, but where are you in your journey to diversifying your board? I believe that this isn't anonymous, this poll, so you can do free text at the end. So where are you on this journey? And there's no judgment here. If you're at the beginning, that's okay. It's about the direction that you're taking. What external support would turn this into practical action for you? So what do you need in order to move things? So that, yeah, the poll is anonymous. So, you know, take a hard look at what you're doing and answer straightforwardly. What learning or support or workshops could you offer to local organisations? We've seen that in the chat already. Lots of people doing things, having workshops. We heard from Craig at City of Sanctuary about what they're offering, but there are other things in the chat. So what offer can you make? What pledge would you like to make to carry this conversation on? And then I think the last question, because I'm not seeing the poll, but is how can we demonstrate progress and hold ourselves accountable for change? And there's a series of questions there. And I think, will the poll results come on? We're going to give you a bit of time just to fill these in. Oh, here we go. That was quick. So let me do, I did used to work in the performance team at the council many years ago, so my skills are rusty, but I can do it. I'll look at the red ones, eh? We are committed, but we'll need support to progress this. Yes, absolutely. Better together. Why not draw on all the expertise that we have in the city and all the energy? 11% already reporting that the board is diverse. Okay. 7% our board is not engaged in this work. So we've got some people who've got a ways to go, and then some people who are really committed and need some support. Okay, that's interesting. What external support would help to turn this into practical action? Overwhelmingly, peer support and networking opportunities. I'd like to think this is the beginning of a practical movement in Sheffield to change, as Shahida says, the decision making. You know, where's the power base in the city, and how do we make that representative? And then finally, so this is asking you about the follow-up event, to share progress and learn from others, and what's the best timescale, and people are overwhelmingly saying within 6 months. So there we have it. So I just want to say, I won't keep you too long because people want to go off and have their dinners, I'm sure. Oh, sorry, there's more polls. So will you, yes, so you pledged, would you be willing to support other local organisations who want to diversify their board? So do you feel like you've got capacity and energy to actively offer support? And then we're going to have one more poll, I believe, which won't, so the final one won't be anonymous. So this one is one where you can actually name the support, which means that the VAS team can follow it up. So let's see what comes back from this one. So willingness to support other local organisations. (50-50). But that's, you know, that's 50% of a large group of people. So that's 60 or 70 people in a city who've got the capacity to do this. Brilliant, thank you. And do we have one more poll, I think? Oh, that was the last one. So it sounds overwhelmingly as though there is appetite to follow this up. So we will leave that to the people at VAS, to their expert convening and networking and partnership skills to pull together the right people to do that. So I just want to say a few words by way of thanks. I know I can see the numbers are starting to go down, so people are going off for other meetings and to have their dinners. So I want to thank you for taking 2 hours out of your busy days to attend, to participate, to contribute to the chat. Really thank you for being here. Let this be the first step in taking action, no matter what the number 10 report says. I want to say a huge thank you to our speakers who've been superb. I hope you'll all agree with that, and really given us a flavour and brought to life what governance can and should do and must do, to use Carl's language. I want to say a huge thank you to South Yorkshire Housing for sponsoring the event, and also to the staff at VAS, Sadaka and Opus for all the hard work they've put into bringing this event together to access their networks, especially VARs, to bring everybody together for the event. So thank you so much. Go forth and prosper. Let's hope that in 6 months' time we can report real progress, and that we're next time talking about the benefits that we can start to see and the impacts that we're seeing from having more diverse and genuinely diverse boards and decision making in the city. So go well. I think we'll keep the Zoom open for a few more minutes if people want to put comments in the chat. But thanks for your time, and we'll see you again in a few months.